So let's talk about the last 2 weeks of January 2026. It was just a whirlwind of headlines that seemed to come out of absolutely nowhere. We're talking about a massive Arctic island, your credit card interest rates, and the war in Ukraine. Now, on the surface, those things have nothing in common, right? But as we're about to see, they were all connected in this really intricate way, tying together global power moves with what was happening right here at home. And just look at this timeline. I mean, the pace was relentless. On January 17th, you've got this major threat against NATO allies over Greenland. Just 4 days later, in Davos, a completely different topic, a populist attack on credit card companies. And then, bam, the very next day, a sudden framework deal on Greenland is announced. 2 days after that, peace talks for Ukraine kick off. And before you can even catch your breath, 3 days later, Trump is in Iowa, starting the midterm campaign. It all feels random, but trust me, the timing is everything here. So, that's the big question, right? How on earth are a huge island up in the Arctic, your credit card bill, and the war in Ukraine all part of the same story? It sounds wild, I know, but they're all pieces of the exact same strategic puzzle. Okay, so to really get how this all fits together, we need to rewind just a little bit to right before everyone headed to Davos. There were basically two big stories blowing up at the same time. One, a super tense diplomatic showdown over Greenland, and two, this surprise move on the domestic front that nobody saw coming. First up, Greenland. Now, President Trump had been talking about the U.S. acquiring this massive, strategically vital island for a while. But in January, things really kicked into overdrive. And this quote from earlier in the month, wow, it really set the tone, suggesting that maybe a simple purchase wasn't the only option on the table anymore. You know, this is why the whole Greenland thing was such a big deal, why it was so explosive. Greenland is part of Denmark, and Denmark is a founding member of NATO. And when you pressure a NATO ally with economic threats, you're poking at the very heart of the alliance. Article 5. That's the core principle. An attack on one is an attack on all promise. Messing with that, it sends real shockwaves across Europe. So while all that is happening on the world stage, this bombshell drops back home. Totally out of the blue, President Trump starts pushing for a 10% cap on credit card interest rates. The reason given was to give American families a break, help them save some money. It was a populist pitch that caught everyone, especially the entire financial industry, completely by surprise. And this is where things get really weird, politically speaking. You had this incredible, unlikely alliance form. Suddenly, you've got President Trump on the same side as progressive senators like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And who were they up against? Well, basically the entire banking industry, with guys like JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon leading the charge. Just a wild combination of players. Okay, so you have Greenland, the credit card fight, the ongoing war in Ukraine, all these separate storylines, and they all converge in one place. The World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. You know, where all the world's biggest political and financial players get together every year. And once he was there, President Trump did not waste a single second. He took that populist message about credit cards and delivered it right to the doorstep of the global financial elite. He used the Davos stage to call them out directly and demand Congress pass that 10% cap. It was a direct challenge, right in their backyard. And yeah, the response was swift. Jamie Dimon, who was also in Davos, fired right back. He basically argued, hey, this isn't going to hurt the banks. It's going to hurt everyone else. He painted this picture of economic chaos for small businesses and everyday people if credit suddenly dried up. The whole situation became such a spectacle that everyone was talking about it. Even Elon Musk got in on it, cracking a joke that kind of perfectly captured the weird, high-stakes vibe of all this deal-making. But you know, in the middle of all this drama, Ukrainian President Zelensky brought everyone crashing back down to reality. He sounded so frustrated with his allies, even comparing his situation to the movie Groundhog Day, because he had to keep asking for the same help over and over. For him, this wasn't some game, it was about survival. So, after all that talk, all that tension in the Swiss Alps, what actually happened? What was the result? Let's break down the immediate aftermath. So first, Greenland. The immediate threat of a trade war, that was taken off the table. After meeting with the head of NATO, President Trump announced he was dropping the tariffs. And in its place, he talked about a new framework of a future deal for Arctic security. But here's the thing. Nobody knew what was in this framework. The details were super vague. And more importantly, Greenland's own prime minister came out right away and basically said, I have no idea what you're talking about. He drew a hard line, saying his country's sovereignty was a red line and absolutely not for sale. All right, then just a couple days after Davos wrapped up, you have the US, Russia, and Ukraine meeting for these much-hyped peace talks in the UAE. But they ended without any real breakthrough. The big sticking point was the same as always: Russia's insistence on controlling the Donbas region, which was a non-starter for Ukraine. And this is so important to remember. While the diplomats were talking in Abu Dhabi, the war was still raging. Russia was launching these huge overnight missile and drone strikes, hitting power plants in Kiev and Kharkiv in the dead of winter. It's just a grim, brutal backdrop for any kind of peace negotiation. And that brings the whole story right back here to the US. Because none of this global maneuvering happens in a bubble, right? It was all building towards a massive pivot to domestic politics and the looming 2026 midterm elections. And that pivot was happening on some pretty shaky ground at home. Remember the One Big Beautiful Bill Act from the year before? It had brought in some pretty controversial changes to healthcare, like new work requirements for people on Medicaid. With projections showing millions of people could lose their health coverage, this was already a huge simmering issue. And if you want to see what that actually looks like for people, just look at a state like Colorado. Because of one rule change in that law, requiring eligibility checks every 6 months instead of once a year, over 1/3 people were suddenly at risk of losing their Medicaid. That's the kind of local, real-world impact that drives national elections. And then, there it is, the pivot. Just 5 days after the Greenland deal and 3 days after the Ukraine talks, President Trump is on stage in Iowa. The focus snaps from the world stage directly to the campaign trail. This was the official kickoff for the 2026 midterm season. And this is how it all gets tied together for the voters back home. At that rally, President Trump laid it out in no uncertain terms. He basically said, winning these midterms is everything. If we lose everything we've been working on, all these deals, all these policies, it could all disappear. That one crazy week in January really pulled back the curtain on how all this stuff is connected. Foreign policy, populist economics, domestic politics, it's all one big game. And it leaves us with a pretty heavy question to think about. When a country's global ambitions and its politics at home collide this hard, what's the real price of winning, both on the world stage and right here at home?